Am I audible? Yes. So, good evening. Thanks for turning up on a weekday. How many people do we have under the age of 25? Okay. Under the age of 30? Okay. Good. So first of all, I'd like to start in the reverse with a vote of thanks. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to interact with this, I call it an enlightened audience, because they've managed to drag themselves on a weekday to a topic which on the face of it sounds boring. So I'll try to keep it as interactive and enlightening as possible, if not enlightening, at the very least entertaining. So in fact, you've touched upon quite a few things that I wanted to. And I think that's a great thing, because that means I'm already speaking with an informed audience. So that gives me an opportunity to take it perhaps to the next level. Just not to brag the way a lawyer is expected to, let me just introduce myself slightly, because there are quite a few misconceptions floating about me, so I might as well clarify them at the outset. One, in US parlance, I'm not a pro bono litigator, I'm not a pro bono lawyer, because in India, if you're treated as a pro bono lawyer, that means in Delhi lingo, you're vela. So you're jobless. So I'm not a public interest litigator. I'm an engineer turned lawyer, with civil commercial litigation and intellectual property litigation being my primary areas of practice and core competence. And the constitutional law happens to be one of my areas of love, so to speak, when I decided to take up law. And after having practiced for close to 7 years and having secured a certain level of proficiency in my profession, I decided to take up constitutional law a bit more seriously, because by then I think I had enough traction going to take up these matters, and also the credentials that I needed to take up these matters. So that's who I am for all practical purposes, and I practiced largely before the Delhi High Court and the Supreme Court. I will not touch anything beyond that. Just a few caveats. I will not be taking too many questions on the merits of the Sabarimala case, because it is sub judice at this point of time. Because the review petition is sub judice, and I certainly don't want to be the consequence or the trigger for any controversy which affects the matter and its outcome, because I believe that the matter or the cause is more important than the individual, and at any point and at any rate more important than the lawyer who is representing the cause. So I would appreciate it if you could address questions which are symptomatic of why we had to deal with the situation of Sabarimala, as opposed to the issue itself. And that would largely be about our legendary apathy as a community. So perhaps you could address those questions, and I'm happy to answer those questions. Why is it that I've actually chosen to take up these causes is something that becomes very, very important, because a book, the content of a book is as important as the author himself and why he has chosen to author something. So I think it's important for you to know who the author is, what his motivations are. I have not been planted by any cultural or political organization in the fray. Let me address that first. I'm not anybody's stooge, I'm not anybody's agent, I'm not anybody's mouthpiece. I am my own agent, I am the principal. So I have a mind of my own. I've taken these causes because I believe in them. And that's something that I've believed in for a very long time. In fact, for me, the transition came in my second year of engineering. In fact, my parents know me as someone who was very, very crazy about pursuing aeronautical engineering, which I couldn't in my undergraduation, and therefore my entire undergraduation was almost spent in preparation for a master's and a career in aeronautical and perhaps in aerospace engineering, but I think destiny had something else in store for me. In 2004, something happened. So this engineering, I was doing it in Tamil Nadu, and I'm someone who's very, very outspoken, so there's a decent chance I may be very, very politically incorrect, both in the Indian sense and the American sense. But this happens to be the land which worships free speech, so I will exercise it to the hilt. So you're welcome to take offense, because I think one thing that comes as part of the right to exercise free speech is the right to offend. So I usually exercise it to the best of my abilities. So what happened then was, in 2004 in Tamil Nadu, if you come from a certain community, especially the Brahmin community, the stigma is particularly high. So I was someone who went into that particular state with a lot of, let's say, preconceived notions about the state, its attitude towards Brahmins, its attitude towards those who do not speak Tamil and whatnot. But frankly speaking, the impression that the media creates and public discourse creates is actually at variance with what one sees or experiences in that particular state. At least that was the case in 2004. Things have changed to the worse at this point. That is a fact. And I don't have a problem stating this on record, I used to have a serious problem with Tamil as a language despite it being my mother tongue, because it was somehow seen as the language of, let's say, the ideology that vilified my community, so to speak. But slowly that narrow mind opened up, and I didn't see the point in hating a language and reinforcing a stereotype that Brahmins have a problem with Tamil. I'd rather oppose that particular stereotype. I'm still in the process of working on that because I've still not learned the script of the language. But I've understood the spirit of that particular land. I've understood what actually triggers it, what it reacts to. I've understood it to a significant extent. And in 2004, something happened. Mr. Vajpayee lost. India was not shining. So the reactions then actually were even more, let's call it, vitriolic. So even friendships were injected with a fair amount of politics because I was openly, let's call it, right of center in my political affiliations. So the moment he lost, and along with it, the lady at the helm in the state lost. In fact, she lost all the 39 seats in 2004, Jayalalitha. She lost all the 39 seats in the state. That's when I realized the extent to which the anti-dharmic sentiment had filled the society and had attained a certain level of normalization. And I wasn't sure what is it that I wanted to do, because I was asking myself, what is it that I'm going to achieve if I succeed in becoming an aerospace engineer and moving out of the country and using India as a launchpad for my destiny or future or whatever it may be. And I had only two options, either to take up civil services or law. These were the only two options that I could think of. The reason I did not choose civil services is because I'm incapable of being a yes man. So I'm fairly candid, I'm fairly blunt in what I say. And to me, law seemed like the best option possible because it allowed me to understand the system and what works and what is the legal underpinning. And you get a ringside view of how the entire thing plays itself out. How a certain thought process converts into a policy decision, translates to a legislative decision, and how it is used politically. These things became even more clear when I decided to take up law as a subject. So that's the reason that I took up the particular subject. But you see, in this profession, what happens is there is a huge gestation period. And I think that's largely true in most countries. Perhaps the period of gestation differs, but there is a significant gestation period compared to any other profession. Perhaps the only other profession that comes closer to the legal profession in terms of its gestation is the medical profession. The return on investment or the speed at which you get recognized is perhaps faster when it comes to the basic sciences or, let's say, the engineering side. That's not the case with legal or the medical profession. So in 2009, believe me when I say this, I said exactly the same things that I've been saying over the last 2 years in terms of what is it that is needed. But then why should people listen to you if you're a nobody? Who are you? You're practically no one. You don't have a godfather. All you have is what you think you're good at, And there has to be a time until, you have to wait for a certain level of validation that has to come from the fraternity, from the rest of the society. And you have to go beyond your professional circles to actually make an impact on the general public. And that takes a significant period of time. So fortunately, what I did was I spent the first 7 years digging my heels into the profession, making sure that when I speak something, at least as far as my subject is concerned, I'm taken seriously. I'm not seen as an empty vessel. And having attained that degree of proficiency, and then having gone independent, I quit as a partner of a law firm, of a leading law firm in the US, in India in 2016. Because if I'd continued to be a partner of a firm, I couldn't have said what I've said after 2016 because that has implications for the outfit that you work for. So then I decided to go independent, and I consciously chose to invest a significant amount of time and resources in practicing constitutional law, in trying to create an interface between the causes that I am passionate about and the skill sets that I think I have. So I tried to blend both. As a consequence of which, in 2017, we set up this organization called the Indy Collective Trust. This is between, in 2004, I was, 19? No, not 19. I finished my engineering at the age of 20, right. So around 13, from the age of 17 to the age of 33, this has effectively been my journey so far. Why is this important? is most families of my generation did not have the time or the luxury to invest in dharmic orientation because they were fighting their own battles. So either you depend on your personal experience or your own interest or the journey that life puts you through to realize that there is a side which is untapped, which is dormant, and which needs attention. But that means there is a significant amount of faith that you put in this chance that someday something will awaken within you that tells you that you have to contribute. That is leaving too much to chance. That says that there is very little human intervention that has led to this particular journey, and a lot of it has got to do with chance. And that is where perhaps my efforts and efforts of people like me are coming from. That's the place we are coming from. That this cannot be left to chance anymore, because if this is left to chance, there's a decent chance that we may not be given a second chance or a third chance. So that's effectively where we are coming from. Now, what does this effectively mean? What does this translate to? How does this affect us? Why did I choose the word Indic identity? Why not Hindu identity? Why Indic? Multiple reasons, and at different levels, trying to address different audiences, so to speak. One, the word Hindu is no more politically correct. So optically and strategically speaking, it doesn't make sense to use the word Hindu anymore. Effectively, that means you have admitted defeat as far as that particular word is concerned. And you may not win the war or the battle in reclaiming that word in a very politically correct manner. It's not going to happen. But I'm not unhappy about it at all, because I'm not a Hindu. That word is not something that has come from this tradition. That word is not ours at all. Hindu is not our word. I can't think of a single scripture where the word Hindu has been used. So I don't have a problem if that particular word is abandoned. And hopefully with it, we abandon the identity that was bestowed upon us by the erstwhile colonial cousins, let's put it that way. Right? So we've managed to abandon that particular identity. I'm happy with that. So what is the word that I think I should choose for myself? Unfortunately, it is a globalized age. I use the word unfortunately deliberately, because you're no more catering to a domestic audience. You're also catering to a global audience, which has a vested interest in what happens in your country, with your culture, with your tradition, with your way of life, and with your civilization. Therefore, you're not talking to members of your family. The outsider has a say, unfortunately, as far as the issues in your home are concerned, and therefore you have to think of that level as well. And that is why the word Indic was chosen, because Indic has less of a religious connotation and more of a civilizational connotation. What does this mean? What is the meaning of this word civilization? And I'd appreciate a few answers here. What is the meaning of this esoteric word called civilization? What is civilization at all? Please feel free to use the rarest of rare commodities, common sense, along with English to answer this question.
Behavior different from animals in jungle.
Okay.
That makes a civilization.
Okay.
Humanity. Being humane.
Okay. So there's a decent chance you're addressing civilized behavior as opposed to civilization in a sociological sense, but fair enough. I take that point. Next. Anybody else? Ladies, please.
A community governed by a set of rules.
Okay.
And people following it.
Okay.
And making the best out of it, making sure it affects the best of the community.
So community which is
governed
ruled by,
let's
say, rule of law, does it necessarily rise to the level of a civilization?
No, that's why I said it has to better the whole of the society,
Okay.
not just a strict civic law.
Okay. Yes?
See, if we break it down, civilization. So I'm taking the first word, civil. So
Right.
civil has got to do something with the governance part of it.
Okay.
So if we take that, then the only thing at that time was governance was the cultural things that was under the governance.
Okay. So let's flip it differently. If I had to ask you to identify certain metrics which tell you how great a civilization is, what will you use to identify the pinnacle of the civilization, the sophistication of the civilization, and its depth? What will you use as markers?
Prosperity.
Prosperity is one. Next.
Language.
Language. Next.
Economy, how
Economy,
large
next.
they were in population,
Lifestyle.
how large they were.
Lifestyle, how large they were. There's something that we are missing.
Lack of conflict.
Morality.
Or
Morality is one, that there's something more that you identify with a civilization, something very soft but very strong.
What you said is not also is very important. Civilization is not having latest gadgets,
Right,
riding in a post car. Anyway,
right,
this the conduct that is important.
right,
Our Indic culture or whatever we emphasize
right.
on conduct and behavior, not on the label.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
You
Would I
see,
be-
the
yes,
way
please.
the common man is treated
Okay.
in that civil, like how it is.
Yes, sir.
I think civilization at their peak, when they get to their peak, they start influencing other people around them.
Okay,
They actually get to a global range.
okay,
The word that you would use, you were in globalization.
right,
That's what happens. If you look at the Roman Empire,
right,
they were considered at their peak.
Right.
Their reach was far the start.
right. So would it
Not
be,
necessarily by rule,
right,
but influence.
so would it be fair to say the cultural impact or the soft impact, the subconscious impact that a civilization has on its own people and the people around it would be a marker of its extent of influence,
exactly.
Yeah.
of the scope of its influence? So would art be at least one of those markers
Yep.
to a significant extent?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
That is what you use to judge how sophisticated that particular civilization is. Because, so there's a popular saying when it comes to history of civilizations, that deeds and works are less trustworthy than art itself, because in art you can't lie. Effectively, the depth of the particular civilization, its definitions of beauty and its definitions of civility come through its art. Therefore, to that extent, art plays a significant role, right? Now, why is this important? I think the fundamental problem that we have had in a very long time, and I say this partly from my understanding of history as a student of history, not even remotely an expert, I'm not a trained historian or a trained student of history, just a normal student of history, a lay student of history. And my understanding of how, let's say, legal systems work and constitutional systems work is we have always approached modern India through the prism of a European nation state.
Sure.
If you look at a European nation, it's either race or language that largely defines its identity. You will not do justice to the idea of India either using language or race. It's going to be impossible to use either of these two metrics to try and define and basket this particular creature, this Jantu. One, because you cannot call any single country of the European Union as we know it today, and you cannot raise it to the level of a civilization. But you can do that as far as India is concerned. Why? Because civilization at the end of the day reflects longevity in a certain journey of that particular culture. The fact that it has managed to encompass within itself multiple identities and subgroups, all having a common strand. Common strand not just for the outsider, but also from within. Which means there is something called Bharatiyata that connects us from the top to bottom, from the left to right, as far as our internal understanding of who we are is concerned, and also as far as the outsider is concerned, because an identity is not just about how you see yourself, but also how the world sees you. Both these matter. Therefore, what does this mean? If India is a civilization, would it be fair to reduce this mammoth concept, this behemoth concept, to the idea of a nation state, and particularly by the word Hinduism? I wouldn't use the word Hinduism one bit at all. Because when you use the word Hinduism, we make the common mistake of actually giving it the status of a religion, as opposed to giving it an ethnic identity and perhaps an ethno-religious identity, the way Judaism is treated to a significant extent. You can have an atheist Jew, a secular Jew. Similarly, you can have an atheist Hindu, a secular Hindu. And there would still be no conflict between your profession as a Hindu and your identity as a Hindu and your belief or lack of belief in a deity. There would be no conflict at all. Because you're perfectly capable of encompassing within that particular definition the concept of a Charvaka, a Nirishwarvadi. Someone who is perfectly comfortable with profession of atheism or even anti-theism and still does not have a problem with his culture, doesn't loathe his identity. Today the fundamental problem is that this so-called esoteric civilization has been molded in the Abrahamic mold, as a consequence of which Dharma has become the Hindu equivalent of Mazhab.
Yes.
And that is where the problem lies. But let me address something more fundamental. For an 18-year-old or a 15-year-old or a 20-year-old, why should all of this matter? How does it make a difference to someone at that particular age when all they're concerned about is peer acceptance, peer pressure, being part of a larger group, their immediate necessities and nothing beyond? Why should it make a difference at all in the first place? If tomorrow your children here who would perhaps fall within what is disparagingly and pejoratively known as ABCD, right? If they fall within that particular basket and they ask you this simple question, why should I put faith in this particular faith system the way you have? How do I benefit from it? What is wrong if I fully assimilate with the culture of this particular land and I move completely away from your roots because they are not my roots? How do you answer that question? How do you answer that question? You can't give all the esoteric nonsense that I just spouted. It's not going to help. They'll say you don't have an answer, so get lost.
You are still part of that community. You are still.
Therefore,
They
don't see themselves as part of the community at all anymore in their headspace.
You have to start them out from a very young age.
Even if you start them out from a very young age, can you cocoon them and protect them from the influence of the outside world? Is there no example that you can think of where somebody has got a dharmic upbringing and has gone completely adharmic after 18 or 20? Of course possible. There are so many Carnatic singers that we can name, right?
As long as you treat the identity with the religion, you're never going to be able to address it.
Exactly, fair enough.
You have to address it
Right,
not as a Hindu,
right.
but as a culture.
Therefore, what do you do?
Therefore, what you do is, I think the best thing to do, or the way you explain it, is this is a way of life, it's not a religion. And if you talk about way of life, then the difference between, if you say a culture, between their culture and my culture, reduces, thereby the acceptance of staying within my culture doesn't have a conflict with their culture.
So that even facilitates conversion,
It will.
right? Because effectively, according to you, if there is no rigid boundary that separates you from somebody else and yours is not a religion in the sense that the Abrahamics understand it and it is a way of life,
Yes.
you have laid down the foundation and the path for conversion. Because that's what is happening all over the world as far as Hindus are concerned.
See, here, and I have the discussion with other people about conversion.
Yes.
And people converting. We have been, if you look at the, or at least the history that is taught to us, right? Indian culture or the Indian subcontinent has been raided by different cultures, different people coming in. And they, in the end, they are the ones who got assimilated. We never assimilated. We never got destroyed. That Hindu.
Thank you for making that
Yes.
point. It's a very important point. Pardon me for saying this. This is the bubble that I want to bust. Pardon me for saying this. Because a significant number of people in this country and elsewhere in the diaspora as well as in India continue to labor under the illusion that since we have survived all the onslaught in every manner possible, we must have done something right. And therefore we must continue making the same mistake because that mistake has kept us alive. I'm sorry, I don't subscribe to that particular notion for a very good reason. Because if you look at history, of course there's a march of history, there's a march of time, and there's only precious little that you can do to prevent that particular march. But the fact remains that your space or the space for your identity has shrunk with time, and perhaps irreversibly, and perhaps irreparably.
Yes, very right.
And with some hope that this generation will put up a semblance of resistance to reverse that particular damage. Let's see what happens, but be that as it may, while geography is no proof of your power or your presence, it is certainly an indicator of how you have fared with time. And the fact remains that you have shrunk to what is known as the modern secular constitutional Republic of India, and you're shrinking even further from within. That is a fact. Apart from the fact that if he thought at one point of time, why should I get into this nonsense, let me run away to greener pastures and that in this particular part of this particular country, the controversy that happened 3 years ago with textbooks proved to you that they will continue to hound you even here. And there is not a single place in earth that you can hope to reside in and hope to avoid all these problems, because even if you choose to leave your identity cannot leave you, and they will continue to foist that identity on you. So I'll give you an example.
So what's here?
I'll just finish this. Can we take this up in Q&A? Let me just make these points. Yeah, because it's just that there's a time, but I'm happy to take your questions. I will not run away from the worst of questions or the best of questions. Okay? So there's a party in Israel which is called the Yesh Atid party, and which is now decided to become part of the blue and white coalition in Israel. Why is it relevant? If anybody has read the history of Zionism and the circumstances surrounding the creation of Israel, Zionism was largely created as a consequence of their belief that the old Jew was weak, was a coward, and did not have what it takes to protect their children and women, and therefore they decided to craft for themselves a new identity called the New Jew. The New Jew was supposed to be secular. The New Jew was meant to create a Jewish state. Look at the contradictions. He was a secular Jew who wanted to create a natural homeland for Jews, and he would quote traditional Jewish literature and still spew venom on it. And he would be the one to establish the state of Israel, and that would be the ideology that would govern Israel from 1948 to 1977, approximately the same amount of time that the Congress party ruled India from 1947 to 1977 until the Janata party came into being. So that was their version of left of center politics. To the extent that the new secular Jew was militant about not professing your faith in public. To the extent that the new secular Jew would believe that the only way for Judaism to succeed and survive in the face of onslaught from the rest of the communities was for it to abandon its past. Our journey has not been too different. What has changed over the years is that the new generation, which is far removed from the generation that established the state of Israel, has decided to go back to the original Jewish literature. And these are the people who set up this party called the Yesh Atid party. So the person who set it up, his name is Yair Lapid. His father, Tommy Lapid, was on a television show with another panelist who was an ultra-Orthodox Jew. And he ended up making the statement that I don't believe in God. This was the statement made by the father of the founder of this party. To which the ultra-Orthodox Jew ends up asking him this question: if you don't believe in God, by what definition are you a Jew? Who made you a Jew? He gave an answer which is extremely telling. Hitler saw a Jew in me. Your faith in your tradition or lack of it does not prevent the outsider from seeing that identity in you. Because he continues to see that as an infestation or a contamination that needs to be exterminated. So you can run away from your identity all you want, but there is no way you can abandon it. Because that is a two-way process, and it comes with your birth. There is no way you can abandon it. You can try and be deracinated as much as you want, but that identity will be foisted on you by the rest of the community and the rest of the world.
Very good.
The answer to your child that you give in this part of the country, and I don't have a solution, I'm just spitballing here and just throwing a couple of options perhaps, is perhaps you can start with, as you rightly said, to some extent I agree with you, by distinguishing your fundamental approach to religion or dharma, and explain the concept of dharma in the simplest of ways possible, and distinguish it from blind faith in a book or a deity. That, according to me, is the fundamental distinction which could perhaps resonate in this rational scientific country. And by explaining that you do not have to try and test your religion on the anvils of science or on the anvils of justice or on the anvils of equality, because this very faith system is built on that particular foundation. You start with that. And you also start with and particularly because you happen to live in this state, it is perhaps the one open architecture that celebrates, encourages and facilitates and allows diversity. No standard issue products, no mass production at all. There is no cutting the head across the board to fit the hat. This is something that you can impress upon your children. Language is important, and I think we have to start teaching our mother tongues, notwithstanding the fact that they may have to interact with the rest of the world in another language. But this is something that you have to start with. But how is this important? Why is this important? So, if I happen to be in the position of the Indian government, I have a legitimate interest in using the Indian diaspora, the Indic diaspora, to further India's interests. Okay? Because there is a certain amount of soft power, there is a certain amount of networking, there is a certain amount of pull, therefore it comes handy when it comes to foreign policy, trade issues and whatnot. But what is your interest in reciprocating? Why should you take an interest in something that happens in India? If you have chosen to make this particular country your home for the future, what is your incentive? What is your angle? What is your cut in this pie? Why should you take an interest?
You want us to answer?
No, I will answer. Or at least I hope to answer. This is the very same question that Israeli Jews are facing with American Jews. It's the very same issue. The tussle that's been going on between these two representatives of the Jewish community is who is the true voice of the Jewish community? Who can claim to be the guardian of the Hindu voice? Should it be the state which has established itself as a Jewish state? Or should it be the diaspora which has existed even before the establishment of the Jewish state? And which has helped the establishment of the Jewish state? That's the question. So every year these people have a visit to the land of birth where they facilitate the visit of Jewish children from America to Israel. So that is their Tirth Yatra.
It's a birthright.
Right. Do you think it's actually helping? No, I don't think so, because if you look at the public discourse, the foremost voices which stand up against the state of Israel, its legitimacy and its policy are Jewish voices. Because their identities have been weaponized to be used against the state of Israel. So you should not fear a non-Hindu voice that speaks out against you, because that has become predictable, that is expected. After 1400 years or since 1 BC or 1 CE, that is to be expected. However, the problem that you actually have is your own people using their own identities or allowing themselves to be used to attack you. That is the problem. We were perfectly comfortable with opposition coming from non-Hindus with respect to our position in Sabarimala, and we could tell them, you have no dog in this race, you have no skin in this game, so get out, it's not your business. We also had enough number of people from non-Hindu communities supporting our position because they understood what we were standing for. But the worst of opposition and the most scathing of criticism came from educated, let me use the word, Savarna girls. Upper caste Hindu girls, if I were to use the politically incorrect term, because they were the ones to stand up and say, we will not apologize for this particular tradition, this is superstition, and they decided to use their identity as a Hindu and their gender as women to attack this particular tradition. How do you respond to that? Because then effectively, the opposition from the other side is going to sit and laugh with a popcorn in hand because you guys are fighting with him. And they've had nothing to do. They don't need to do anything because somebody else is doing the talking for them. That is the danger. Second, there is a significant amount of chance that deracination, when they grow up here as part of the diaspora, is a consequence of, as Sir rightly pointed out, the negative stereotypes about India and its culture. Therefore, at the very least, if you have an interest in in protecting your child from being exposed to that kind of slander and libel, you have no other option but to work along with the motherland to address this particular issue. There is your selfish motive and there is your incentive to take an interest in what happens there. I can't think of any other legitimate incentive or real-time incentive for you to actually take a concrete interest, because I think gone are the times when you can actually ask people to believe in something because it's right or it's the right thing to do. That is the dharmic way of going about it, but we are living in the age of IPR, so I need to give an incentive for the quid pro quo to actually work. So the quid pro quo is this. If you take your identity seriously and you want to pass on that identity to your child, you have no other option but to take part in the active politics of that particular country, which is not a politics for resources, which is not a politics about economics, which is not a politics about supremacy of any other kind except cultural and religious supremacy. That is a fact. It is an identity-oriented issue. That is something that you cannot run away from. So, why am I actually making this point? The last mandate of this government was interpreted as a development mandate. And the current mandate of Mr. Modi is also being interpreted, unfortunately, as a pure development mandate. Which means any concern which forms part of an identity agenda is effectively being relegated to the sidelines and to the margins. There is a decent chance that, having benefited from the munificence of this country, from the prosperity of this country, from the economic progress of this country and the scientific advancement of this country, you want to see India in the same mold as America. I would request you to not make the same mistake. Because history is telling us that times are changing, and civilizational states such as China and India will effectively dominate the future. The future belongs to them. Therefore, it is all the more in your interest to be on the winning side. But most importantly, when I say civilizational state, a nation state, what does all this exactly mean? I'll try and simplify this to the best of my abilities. India is a country in the modern sense. But it is the successor state of a civilization. So, when did this political entity called China exist? Since when has it been in existence? Any wild guesses?
About 3,000 years or so.
As China, as we know it, as a single geographic political entity.
1700 or 1800, when the king, one guy combined all these
Right.
5 provinces.
Right. So,
The political entity, they only came into being after the Second World War. If you look
so
at-
as we know it today, it's only after the Maoist revolution,
Yeah.
right, and after the Civil War. But there has been at least a recorded history of continuous existence of this particular country under an empire, the Qin dynasty, as you rightly pointed, that's been in existence. You cannot say that of India because you've had only 3 or 4 empires which have managed to rule over large parts and swathes of India, right? However, the two things that are common about India and China which distinguish them from the rest of the world is they do not base their identity on traditions inspired by religion. You could largely trace the rise of the West to its belief in Judeo-Abrahamic traditions, coupled with its incestuous behavior with Roman and Greek philosophy, where they try and cannibalize everything under the sun. If you look at the state seal of California, I was just discussing this yesterday, it has Minerva in it. What has America got to do with Minerva? That's a Roman goddess for wisdom and art. What is Minerva doing of all the places in the state seal of California? I don't understand. And that too, she's standing next to a bear. I don't understand, right? But you see, what is the point that is being made? The point that is being made subtly is that this particular country sees itself as a continuum of that particular civilization in several ways, and is also comfortable amalgamating that particular identity with its Judeo-Abrahamic traditions. When you speak of the Islamic civilization, I think it is self-explanatory as to what it derives its inspiration from. You don't need to say anything further, right? So perhaps you could put Europe and United States in the basket of the West and say that perhaps they have some common basis. You cannot make the same statement as far as China and India are concerned. these are what is known as civilizational states. They are not nation states. Because they do, so India perhaps has a greater basis to lay claim for being a civilizational state because China is based on largely the Han identity, the Han Chinese identity. That's not the case with India. Even within Hindus, you cannot come out with ethnic homogeneity. It's difficult to actually arrive at that particular common base. Therefore, according to me, the best possible country that qualifies as a civilizational state is India. If you read Savarkar's Hindutva, his position is no different. Hindutva is all about establishing a civilizational basis for India's nationalism as opposed to religious nationalism. He himself was an atheist. How could he have laid basis for nationalism on the basis of religion? He couldn't have. I am not a Savarkarite. I am only trying to say that this much maligned word Hindutva practically translates to identifying India as a civilizational state. That's it. So if you look at the tussle that we are going to see in our life and times, is fundamentally going to be between the ideology of a nation state and a civilization state. United States is going to say, or the West is going to say, our model is the one that effectively facilitates immigration, it facilitates open sourcing of ideas, and it does not strike a distinction or discriminate between people on the basis of race, caste, or gender, as a consequence of which any other point of view is fundamentally illiberal. Therefore, since they have positioned themselves in the liberal camp at the outset by default, every other point of view is bound to be illiberal according to them. So the contours of the debate or the boundary conditions of the debate are set in such a fashion that बस का ये जो seat है ये तो खाली नहीं है तो बचा सिर्फ ये तो आप बन गए illiberal. So this is the only seat that is left, this is the only seat that is vacant, and therefore you're forced to put yourself in that illiberal basket. That is effectively how this is being played out. But the difference between us and China is this, that that country has the civilizational confidence to cock a snook at the West and the United States and says, I don't care about the labels that you put on my forehead. I am what I am and I will succeed and I'll make your people question their way of life, which is what they've succeeded in doing now. If there are questions that are being raised in Western Europe and in United States about the feasibility and the viability of the democratic model or the open model of the West in dealing with issues such as illegal immigration, with demographic inversion, and such issues where democratic values are being used against democracy itself, that is when people are forced to look at other options which are presented to them, such as the Chinese option. It is a sad fact that India is still not an option worth looking at for anyone who's looking for alternatives. For the simple reason that we have been so dharmic and I would say unsmart. We have put them in mutually exclusive baskets. That we have not been able to present to the world what is our story in a comprehensive manner. There is no grand narrative that you've been able to weave before the world. As a consequence of which, when they discuss the most ancient of civilizations, they will even speak of Egypt and Mesoamerican civilization, but certainly not the Indian civilization. Despite the fact that our timelines speak of yugas and manvantaras. That is our timeline, and still we don't figure anywhere in the last 5,000 years. And our origins are still being traced to Central Asia. So, what I'm trying to say is, perhaps this phase in history has given us an opportunity to change the narrative around on that particular front. But that is not going to work if these topics and these issues are relegated to what I call the post-dinner Katha Kalakshepam. They cannot qualify as mere academic discussions on the dinner table or at the dinner table, and they must go beyond it because it is a question of your survival as a as a civilization. You may not value civilization as long as you take it for granted. But when one by one each aspect of your identity is cannibalized, is misappropriated, right, and you're not in a position to lay claim to it, that is when you realize, oh, this was mine. Yoga is out of my hands. You have beer yoga and what nonsense. Everything happens under the sun. Everything under the earth goes on in this place. Or even in India. Why just this place? Right? So, when you say that I'm universal and universalist and my ideas are meant for the benefit of the world, that still doesn't take away your right to claim that you are the origin of that particular idea, or that it started from you. So when it is absolutely convenient, you use negative stereotypes to brandish or to tar this entire community, and you conveniently now associate yoga with Buddhism as if Buddhism has come out from the Far East as opposed to India. People believe, and perhaps this is, and since it's a temple, pardon me for using this language, people believe that India's sexiest import is Aishwarya Rai. I believe it's Buddhism. Because it has managed to pack itself so well, and package itself so well, and distance itself from Hinduism so beautifully, that all our best facets, or at least, let's say, saleable aspects, are no more claimable by the Hindus. What does this mean? What can you do? How do you turn this narrative around? Education, culture, environment, gender rights, indigenous rights, and legal systems. These are going to be the battlegrounds. Apart from, pardon me for sounding like a Shakha going Swayam Sevak, demographics. Without numbers, you're nothing. You cannot hope to survive. There are enough examples from India itself to show that demographic balance is the name of the game. There is no concept of pluralism, there is no concept of a secular dharmic society which can exist unless and until this particular society with its mindset and with its universalist outlook continues to survive in larger numbers. I don't think you would have to think about demographic balance as an issue if somebody were not using it as a weapon. If somebody did not believe in inverting demographics to change the balance, you need not worry about demographic balance. Then you focus on other aspects. But because somebody has decided that numbers are fundamentally important and they've decided to reverse those numbers, you have no other option but to pay attention to it. I certainly don't subscribe to that school of thought which believes that the zenith of tolerance is to tolerate intolerance. I will not tolerate it even one bit in the name of political correctness. Political correctness is effectively being used to gag you from speaking the truth and to address issues openly. And surprisingly, it is being used at the same time when they are deifying free speech. It makes no sense whatsoever. So, when you speak of the Indic identity, you're not fighting for a religion. You're not even fighting for a way of life. You're fighting for a faith system that believes in knowledge, as oxymoronic as it may sound. It is a faith system that believes that righteousness is the heart of every faith system. And therefore the word dharma is never to be equated with or treated as a synonym of religion. Dharma at the heart of it is a fundamentally legal concept, it's a jurisprudential concept which effectively seeks to strike a balance between individual avarice and greed and social responsibility, and says, okay, what is this entire calculus for? It is to ensure that you are muktified, so to speak, from the cycle of life and death. Therefore, the goal is not salvation, but liberation. There being a significant difference between the two. If that is what is your basis, for a generation that worships science, rationality, justice, equality, I can't think of a better concept to sell. This is your best marketing tool. Particularly because in this part of the world they believe so much in indigenous rights, they should be fighting for our rights then. We are the indigenous people. If you're fighting against colonialism, imperialism, we are the ones who have borne the brunt of it in every possible manner. Religious imperialism, colonialist imperialism, every form of it possible. It's surprising that we have not even succeeded in playing victim properly. Everybody else seems to be a past master at doing that, but we can't even push our own story as victims. We can't call ourselves oppressors because we have adopted this falsified notion of non-violence without understanding what it is meant for. And we have not even been able to sell our stories as victims. That is, according to me, the proverbial dog in the manger. Na ghar ka na ghat ka. So, if this is to be remedied, what is it that you as a community can do? I'll be blunt here again. I see a fair amount of fractious dynamic being played out in multiple organizations which operate out of this country when it comes to who represents the Hindus of America. Okay? It's almost similar to how the Jews keep fighting. So there's a saying, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. I would say 2 Hindus, 20 opinions. So that is something that is very, very true of us. But if we do not realize the magnitude of the problem that is facing us, it is not about you facing an existential threat to your survival, but if you fall, along with you falls every indigenous non-Abrahamic community and way of life across the world, from the east to the west. Your existence gives hope to a lot of people that it is possible to adopt and approach and embrace a different way of life without being vilified, without being discriminated against. That is your responsibility as inheritors of such a great civilization, that you take the lead on this particular front. I say this without any training in economics, that unless and until you address the question of identity and the civilizational crisis that is currently facing you, no matter how much you succeed economically, you will always be vulnerable to attacks from within and outside. And you will implode, and your values will be used against you the very same way that Europe is imploding at this point of time. Economic success is important. There is no doubting it. As Swami Vivekananda says, you should not be talking about dharma to someone who doesn't have a piece of bread. It doesn't make sense. But you should also ensure that dharma tells you that you cannot just give him the bread, you also give him back his identity, because with identity comes confidence and his ability to stand upon his own 2 feet. That is what is the relevance of identity. So, as a diaspora which seems to have the ear of this dispensation in India, which seems to have given the rock star status to Mr. Narendra Modi, I think it is imperative that you start identifying your wish list when it comes to the identity agenda and push the envelope on that particular front, and ensure that in these 5 years at least 3 or 4 concrete deliverables on the identity front are addressed for eternity and for good. I have made this one of my talking points not because I am a one-trick pony, but because I see the rejuvenation of the Indic civilization through this particular nerve center, which is the temple. If temples in America are free and are community run, what is it about the Indian constitution and Indian version of secularism which demands that every Hindu institution and Hindu institution alone operate under the thumb of the government? Do you not trust the Hindu community in America to run its own institutions? Or is it your case that Hindus in America are less corrupt than Hindus in India? Please make that statement. You'll be affecting your own relatives. Go ahead, make that statement.
It all started with the first government during most formative years. He corrupted, introduced the Sharda Act, all sorts of things were done so that it will be under his control.
Agreed, sir.
He was guilty of partition.
Agreed, sir.
Yeah, see.
The problem is you can blame the thief only so much, but if you keep the door open too often, you have to blame it later.
We have to overcome it. Yeah, we don't have to keep quiet.
Right.
We have to overcome it, but it can be done, and it is there, as you know, directive principles of constitution, which are there never to be implemented.
Right.
I did not read the subject, but I think one of the thing is the framework was not there. The tax framework, the management and framework. How come the Christian institutions and the other religious institutions having their independence, but the Hindu religious institution, one reason could have been given easily is that, well, there is no management. The money and overall governance and management is there, so we need a government institution, because it's such a large institution, it has to be
Right.
managed.
Right. So, having studied the subject to a significant extent, allow me to correct you on that particular front. I may be wrong still, but having worked on this front for a significant amount of time, I know what exactly.
I'm not saying it is right, that
No,
could
no,
have
I
been the
understand.
reasons,
I'm
they would have
saying-
used that as a reason.
Right. I'm saying that that's not even the reason historically. Historically, the reason has been slightly different. And each of these reasons are not uniform across the country, because these are largely state legislations, and therefore there are multiple local reasons. But the one strand, or let's say the one commonality among all these legislations, is that there has been no fundamental question that has been asked, which is, if the state has the right to slap everyone equally, why has it decided to slap one community exclusively? Right? That is the fundamental question. Right? And the problem with that particular question is not the opposition that is coming from the government, but the opposition that is coming from within the community again. Because several members of the community believe that if this particular institution were to revert to the hands of the community, then it will lead to one, Brahmin domination, and two, it will lead to corruption. Therefore, what does it tell you? That vilification of the Brahmin is effectively leading to vilification of the community at large and to deprivation of control over your own institutions. Therefore, this soft target called Brahmin has effectively been used as the strawman argument to deprive you of your own assets over your own, let's say, of your own community. So the problem is, some of us are happy because, oh, he's the one who's anyway getting vilified, so what's my problem? Tell me that this won't happen with the landed community next. Tell me this won't happen with the next community, the Kshatriya community or any other community next. You have to understand that whatever differences that we may have and whatever grievances that we may have is for us to address within. But that does not hand the state an excuse to take over our institution, because it is not an institution that belongs to the Brahmin, but it is an institution that belongs to the community. So even if one person or one group is being cited as an example or as a facade or a pretext to take over the community's institutions, it's surprising that the rest of the community is silent, because mentally they have said, while I may visit that particular place for spiritual and religious solace, this institution anyway belongs to that fellow who wears the sacred thread, let him go and bear the brunt of the state. That is the hypocrisy in our heads. And that is the compartmentalization in our heads. We don't realize that whether we like it or not, that community is not, or let's say that identity is not limited to a particular race or a group or ethnicity. They are going after the institution of Brahmanism, which has a different status under Dharma as opposed to going after Brahmins. That is a problem. If they went only after Brahmins, that would still be okay. But if they are going after the concept of Brahmanism, which has now become such a vilified word, which has been loaded with poison, they have effectively gone after. So let me try and address this differently. If an outsider has chosen to repeatedly attack one facet of your identity, he has identified two things. This seems to be that facet which, if it falls, will lead to a domino effect across the community. Because he has identified that this is the particular identity that needs to be attacked over and over again. Because this represents the voice of the person who stands up for Dharma. I am not identifying a caste. I am identifying a social role. I am identifying a specific identity which is decodes a caste identity. Please understand that. I am someone who strongly supports Dvijas among so-called non-Brahmins also. Because the definitions are different. Therefore, if you go after this particular community, you've gone after that person who is supposed to be preaching Dharma to the rest of the community. And with his fall, why is it that every evangelical organization does not tire from telling us that the first set of people to be converted in Kerala were the Nambudris? Why do they have to highlight this fact over and over and over again? Why do they have to highlight the fact that the first set of people to be converted to Christianity in Goa were the Konkani Brahmins? Why do they have to make this point? Why don't they start with the Dalits or the SCs or the Chaudhurys or the Naidus or the Kammas or the Kapus or any other community? Why don't they start with that? Why do they keep highlighting this fact? Because they expect a domino effect.
Yep. The knowledge source.
Exactly.
Exactly.
That is the point. They are going after the source of your knowledge. And along with it, every Indic traditional system, every Indic knowledge system is being appropriated. Every church which is now consecrated and established in Kerala starts with a proper Bhumi Puja. The consecration of a Dhvajastambam. Why? Because they know the value of that particular ritual better than us. And they have decided to appropriate it and adopt it. Whereas we have decided to impute that particular ritual and associate it with one particular caste or community. Look at it. They are comfortable with it because they know there is a value in these rituals. It's just that they don't want this ritual to be performed under the heading of Hindu anymore.
Cultural misappropriation.
This is cultural misappropriation of the first order. That's how Rome became Christian Rome. Africa has lost all its land and received Christianity in return. And we are on the same path. There's no difference. The surprising part is, we have not been able to showcase one Holocaust like the Jews have. We have not been able to showcase proselytization like the Africans have. Everybody else has succeeded in showcasing themselves as victims except us. I am not asking you to develop a victim complex. I am not asking you to find justifications for inaction. Please strike a distinction. I am simply saying you should have the courage of your conviction to speak the truth about your past, not because you're seeking retribution or revenge. You're simply saying enough is enough and never again. That's it. That's all you're saying. For that to happen, kindly do not conflate political victory with civilizational victory. I am not asking for civilizational victory, I am asking for civilizational balance. I am asking for an exercise in truth and reconciliation when it comes to civilization. As simple as that. Allow us to showcase what has happened with us and who are the perpetrators so that the next generation does not repeat the same mistakes. I have said this before, I'll say this again. You decided to show the mirror to the Brahmin community to ensure that future Brahmins do not repeat the same caste-based prejudice as far as the future is concerned, as far as the next generation is concerned. Why is this logic any different from any other community? One of the reasons that you undertake an exercise in historical analysis is to identify what are the lessons that we can learn from the past for the future. How is it that every other community is exempt from this kind of exercise except the Hindu community? How does it make sense?
Doesn't.
Therefore, kindly use the next 5-year window to push these goals. If I ask for freedom of Hindu religious institutions from the state, which community other than the Hindu community is going to be affected? Is that a communal request? Is that a communal wish? I am asking for my institution to be freed from the clutches of the state. Who are you to talk? You have no business in this. But you will see that the voices which oppose this will be funded by non-state actors and outside actors.
Yes, absolutely.
And that situation will not change unless and until we find within us the guts to speak the truth. Pardon me for making this statement, but I'm going to request you to push the envelope. I assume that Indians and Hindus in this particular country have lived at least for 2 generations. Therefore, Maslow's basic needs have been fulfilled. Now is the time for you to move to the next level. You are not going to be mere salaried employed people in this country. It is time for you to assert your position in this country and speak for your interests and your community's interests. That is imperative. Subhiksham cannot be the end game. You can have individual surplus, but it will mean nothing when they come after you for being part of a certain community. So kindly coalesce. These talks must translate to some kind of concrete action where there is a working group that decides to represent the interests of the community from this part of the country and decides to take an active role in what happens in India as far as the community's interests are concerned. Questions, please. Yes, sir.
Concentration camp in
Please
China.
identify yourself and then the question, sir.
Sure, my name is Mayank Dave. And question about concentration camp in China. There are 2 million Muslims there in camp right now.
Right, sir.
And they are demolishing all the mosques, all the structures.
Right, sir.
The world is silent on that.
Right, sir.
If we do something like that in India, what would be the impact?
I think the question is rhetorical, you know what the impact will be. But I don't think we should do what China is doing.
No.
So my point is this. I think we would do serious injustice to our values if we resorted to the same kind of behavior. I am not asking you to be patient like Gandhi, who says, let your women and men die and throw them into the sacrificial fire until the barbarian reforms himself. I am not making that statement at all one bit. The response has to be slightly different. The response is to first of all assert legally, politically, socially and culturally your civilizational ethos without any sense of shame, without any sense of embarrassment, so that it becomes clear that this is the natural homeland first for Indic communities. But everybody else will be treated with respect, provided you do not endanger the very house you have been given refuge in. As long as you don't have the guts to take that position, you will always look for extreme solutions. You doesn't mean you, sir, I'm generally saying, right? I'm merely saying that we are forced to look at such extreme options because there's a lot of impotent rage which is boiling and simmering within us.
Yes.
And we are not looking at intelligent, suave, sophisticated, politically correct options to present what has become politically incorrect. You should know how to weave and navigate this maze of political correctness and yet make your point confidently. If you don't learn that, and if you don't hone that particular art, and you don't teach the next generation to become ambassadors of your community, then you will produce an assimilated, deracinated lot, which will benefit anybody else and everybody else except us. Let's start with that. Because China has been able to do that for multiple reasons. One, because of a combination of factors. One is the model of governance, which is, if their own people don't have rights, what rights will others have? Forget it, right? If you have to build a road either in the United States or in India, you have to take permission from everybody else. And usually the road which was meant to be like this would have become like this. But there they can draw a straight line and they can do what they want without taking permission from anyone. So you cannot compare yourself with that kind of a system. Second, fundamental ideology of Confucian Chinese system is uniformity and order. If you notice the speeches of Xi Jinping over the last 3-4 years, where he's been speaking of China as a civilizational state, as opposed to Buddhism, Taoism and Confucianism, he's going back to Confucianism because that philosophy emphasizes on uniformity. That's not the case with Taoism and Buddhism. Therefore, he has cherry-picked that particular strand of philosophy that is consistent with the worldview of the Communist Party of China. No party in India can hope to do that because of the sheer diversity. And most importantly, I think as opposed to playing good victims, we will hand another opportunity to the world to call us oppressors. 2002, where the facts have been distorted, has been used to brandish us all over the world. Notwithstanding the fact that 69 people were burnt before that in a train. Nobody talks about it at all. So I don't think you should look at these options. One, because it is ethically wrong. Not just because it is optically wrong, but it is ethically and morally wrong. But as inheritors of an argumentative tradition, I'm sure we are capable of better strategies to deal with the situation. Particularly because this is not a time when people are limited to newspapers. You have so many means of democratization of opinion. Social media, discussion forums, a prosperous diaspora, which is capable of shouting from the US about India, both in the positive as well as in the negative. These factors and these resources must be used first. If they still don't work, whether you like it or not, or I like it or not, history will find a way.
Yeah, but gentleness is in vain when vengeance follows.
Sorry, sir?
Gentleness is in vain vengeance hollow.
I am not going to ask you to be gentle at all. My suggestion or my message is not gentleness at all. In fact, the root of my message, the spirit of my message, everywhere I've spoken, is Kshatra, Kshatra and Kshatra alone. Regardless of which community you come from. Which is action, action and action alone. I am not asking you to be passive, inert, dormant, silent, docile. No. I am asking you to first start talking, assert yourself politically, assert yourself in every platform possible, take an interest in every election, in every policy, and ask yourself if it is furthering your interest as a community, as a dharmic community, whether or not it is consistent with the conception of dharma. Ask that question. When dharma becomes a central foundation for policy making in India, you won't be asking this question anymore. The need for this question would have become redundant. Next. Yes.
So, may I ask 2 questions?
One first.
One for him, one for myself.
Okay.
So, I mean, he actually came with me by his own motivation, so,
Great.
I just want to ask you, what few words do you say to somebody, of his age, because, he wants a reward to have a picture after that with you.
I think I
brought
walked into a
him
trap.
only because,
Okay. Go to a temple once a week. Learn at least one shloka. When people ask you what is your identity, say you're a Hindu first. Speak in your mother tongue as much as you can, at least within the confines of your home. Read Amar Chitra Katha.
so he's expecting a reward to have a picture with you. So my question is actually, we raised one of the pillars, legal pillars, right? And we talked about how our assets have been appropriated by, various ways for many, many hundreds of years, And this is one thing which I experienced also because I'm part of SVASA in Bangalore, and getting more involved into these things. And I also found now, for example, yoga, so the first line of defense is making sure that we actually control our assets, And I see that at no level, whether at institution or at government level, anybody is having any cohesive, concentrated effort to do that, to the extent that now yoga is no more an Indian word, I mean, like you see all the yoga things that you just mentioned, So, and you are also an intellectual property right expert, So, what are the things that you think can be done? Because slowly, if we don't protect our assets,
I get your question.
So
I'll answer it.
Yeah.
You won't believe it. My parents were there at the Sunnyvale talk. This question was asked by 2 gentlemen, even in that part, in that talk. And that tells me, and I'm not being condescending even one bit, because even I'm learning as I go along. I don't think I have 100% solutions, and there is no degree of certitude. I just know what the goal is. Perhaps the means may change. But we are still dancing around the bush as opposed to hitting the bush.
It's ours.
No. First you go after conversions, please. Please understand how this ecosystem works. And that's where I think we are failing, and that's surprising. Why are they appropriating the sabji, the roti, or rather everything else in the thali except the roti? Why are they appropriating everything else and just leaving this unappropriated? They don't touch it at all. Why? Because when the new convert steps into the new home, they want him to feel comfortable and reduce the level of shock that he goes through because of a civilizational change or a cultural change. So when you appropriate each of these aspects, the church is now in the same mold as the temple, making it easy for him to say, "Kya badal gaya? Ye to hai." And my philosophy says everything is equal and everything is the same. We don't even understand what is the context of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, but we keep mouthing it over and over again. Okay? And therefore, we decide therefore these people adopt each of these or appropriate each of these markers of identity to facilitate conversions with ease. That's the first thing that you need to understand. Second, they want to undermine and erode every aspect of your identity which gives you confidence. Therefore, your positive achievements are being taken away from you. Therefore, all you will be left with are sati, dowry, caste, untouchability, and that's it, and a history of defeatism accordingly. I mean, that's how they've effectively portrayed your history, that you've lost and yet you've survived miraculously. I don't know how that works. But the point is, as long as you do not have the guts to take a position against fraudulent conversion, you will continue to ask this question. Today they'll appropriate this, tomorrow they'll appropriate something else. It's legally very difficult to try and protect all of this without addressing the central question of identity. And I'm repeating the answer that I gave elsewhere. If 1.3 billion Hindus or 1.3 billion Indians decide to convert to one faith out of their own volition, can you stop them? No, you can't. If it is a conversion born out of conscience, out of a change of heart. However, if other incentives are being given and they're being induced, at the very least you must be in a position to take a position against fraudulent and induced conversions. That is something that you must start with. The day you start doing this is when they will know that this is not to be touched. Because then they will not have an incentive to touch it anymore, because they cannot achieve what is the ultimate goal, which is proselytization, harvesting of souls. So why don't we start talking about it? What is wrong in saying that fraudulent conversion from or to Hinduism is problematic? You're not protecting your street alone, you're also protecting somebody else's identity. You're saying fraudulent conversion by any person to any faith. Start taking a position. There are countries which have anti-conversion laws. So if somebody tells me how is this legally enforceable, there are ways and means to do it. But the moment you take such a position, that reflects your seriousness about this particular issue. Otherwise, you're only interested in protecting something else. I'll give you another example. So every time we talk about Israel, I have geniuses telling me, Israel is a startup nation. Israel is this, Israel is that. Then you're missing the point of being Israel. The success of that state lies in being able to retain its Jewish identity despite hundreds of UN resolutions against it every year. Even Sudan does not have as many resolutions against it passed by the United Nations as Israel has. Imagine. If you look at the history of the number of UN resolutions being passed against Israel, it's astounding. What is it that the country has done to merit these kind of... Pakistan doesn't get so many resolutions. Zimbabwe doesn't. No country which is being run by drug lords gets these kind of resolutions. But Israel gets it. The only possible democracy in that volatile region, which has adopted for itself a religious identity and still promises equality to everybody else. 8.5 million people in that particular country, 2.5 million Arabs, they enjoy equal rights as the Jews in that particular country. And still people have a problem with that state because they have a problem with the Jewish identity. That is the same issue with us. Nothing that you do which is right will ever be lauded or you will be given credit for because they have a problem with that identity. If this is fear-mongering, so be it. I don't care a damn about making this statement because I know what I'm talking about. This is a fact. Somebody has to say it, I'll say it. So start taking a position about protecting your fundamental identity. Next.
So
The lady first.
when you talk about identity, our beauty about our identity is diversity within Hinduism.
Correct.
Which is also not a beauty, right? Because when you talk about Hinduism, there's a Krishna and a Shiva and everything, which there's so much beauty in it if you understand it.
Right.
Right? The fact is most people don't understand it.
Right.
And that works against you. So if you take Israel, there's a single identity.
Right.
That's not the case for India or
Okay.
Hinduism.
Okay.
And how do you resolve that? To take that identity, you have to resolve that problem first.
Right, ma'am.
And you have to put a lot of the, lack of a better word, ritualistic aspect aside so that you can bring people together and get them to see that it's all one.
I agree with you and vociferously disagree with you, and I'll explain why. I agree with you that fundamentally, unless and until there is a unity in identity, it's difficult to address any of the problems that we are beset with. I agree with you on that front. But I disagree with you on the means that you suggest, and for a very good reason. One, Hindus who are fascinated by the state of Israel and its history and its fortitude have misread the history of that country is my first submission. Because you have to read to know the sheer diversity in the Israeli identity and how difficult it has been for them to forge this state when diaspora has come from hundreds of countries, having lived in each of those countries for millennia, not speaking the same language, not eating the same food. Why is it that you have such diversity in the cuisine in Israel? It's not because there are so many immigrants of other ethnicities, but because there are Jewish immigrants of so many ethnicities coming from other parts of the world. From Ethiopian food to Russian food and whatnot. when they don't speak the same language and they come with different set of worldviews, how is it that they've still managed to survive? Because I went to Israel last October on a trip which was part of a delegation funded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Israel to read the country's central institutions. And this is what I've understood based on the reading of the literature and meeting of the people. It could be very limited, very flawed, but for whatever it is worth. That's a society which is like concentric circles. There is the ultra-Orthodox Jew, then there is the Orthodox Jew, then there is the religious Jew, then there is the secular Jew, and then there is the atheist Jew. The one thing that is common, they are not ashamed of the fact that they are Jews. They have different definitions of how to practice Judaism. Secular Jewish synagogues are no different from churches where they sing with guitars. That is harakiri in a ultra-Orthodox synagogue. I've been to one, I've spoken at one. On a Sabbath in Shavuot. So I know what it means. In Rochester in 2016. So they are very different from each other. But the reason is they've decided to unify through one thing, and I'll tell you what they did. When Hebrew was being proposed as a language for unifying all the Jews in the country, we would assume that they all agreed unanimously. You have no idea the amount of opposition that came to the adoption of that language as the national language. One gentleman, his name is Yehuda ben Eliezer, was the one who was credited with pushing for Hebrew as the national language of that particular country, and he was branded a crackpot for the better part of his life. Ultimately, they realized what he said makes sense because language is the first path to unity. The moment you start this discussion in India, you're seeing the discussion that's happening with respect to the national education policy and the imposition of Hindi. When Sanskrit was mooted as a national language along with other languages at the time of the debate in the Constituent Assembly, the geniuses said, no, this will affect minorities. If there is a version of Indian Islam and there is a version of Indian Christianity, why can't Indian Muslims and Indian Christians speak in Sanskrit? If you believe that there is a version of Indian Islam and Indian Christianity, what is wrong in actually speaking in Sanskrit? On one hand, you want to say yoga and Sanskrit don't belong to Hinduism, but the moment I introduce Sanskrit as a language, you have a problem with it. How mighty convenient. You can't have the cake and eat it too. This is a proper Genusian face with a forked tongue speaking from both sides of its mouth. How is this even possible? This is the hypocrisy that you need to start calling out. Second, I will never subscribe to the notion that rituals stand in the way of unity. Not one bit. It goes against my grain. It goes against what I believe in. So therefore there's a personal bias. But my experience tells me that you rob people of what they believe in the interest of unity. What are you exactly unifying for? You would have killed everything else. Let me finish my point. I'm not done yet. As a lawyer, I'm entitled to speak loudly. So I'm making the point that you tell people that the only way you will survive and your identity can be protected and the diversity can be protected is when you see that you need to stand by each other and with each other when there is a common issue or a common threat. That I think is possible. I would strongly be a votary of a three-tier language system as far as India is concerned. The mother tongue without a doubt. English, yes, without a doubt, because you need to speak with the rest of the world in a language it understands and respond to them when they start creating negative stereotypes about you. 3 is Sanskrit. So that they see a commonality between the individualistic expression of their language and the mother lode or the mothership. And they're able to see a commonality in the culture that connects Kanyakumari to Kashmir and Assam to Gujarat. They should be able to see all of this. At the very least, we should start with that. 2, it is important for us to revise history. But that battle is an uphill battle which I don't think any dispensation, even the current dispensation, has the guts, the confidence, the gall, the gumption to actually undertake. Because that takes a lot of courage, that takes a lot of preparation, that takes a lot of depth. I don't think they're up to the task at this point. What do they do then? Again, simplistic but fairly obvious and therefore reasonably worth considering. Let the temple in each place start its own educational institutions and teach the culture of that particular place. If others don't want to come to that particular institution, so be it, you go to your own institution. We want our children to learn history from the source of our history and our traditions. How many Hindu parents will send their children to schools run by temples as opposed to convents to learn English?
Not too many.
That's the point. So again, there is a colonized mindset which is still working. So you've not addressed the fundamental issue, which is education. The first thing that the Jews did was to focus on education. And that is seen as an elitist project in India. खाने के लिए कुछ नहीं है, आप तो पढ़ाई की बात कर रहे हैं. अरे, schools नहीं चाहिए क्या? You have to focus on both. So that, according to me, I will not subscribe to casting Sanatana Dharma in an Abrahamic mold to stave off the threat of Abrahamism. Then there is no threat, you have become them. Where is the question of
I think
fighting?
you misunderstood my question.
Then please explain it to me,
My
I'm sorry.
question was,
Right.
the beauty in our diversity, which is the basis of our religion, the fact that we have, whether it's 3 million or 30 million, whatever the count may be, that is the beauty that we give.
Right,
And that's a beauty that the world needs to have.
Right.
That's saying, we accept the diversity, but we're one. We have lost the oneness in that.
Okay.
You see a lot of division.
Right.
And how do you bring that and still live that diversity?
Right.
And that is where I was trying to go.
so which is why the focus on a civilizational state translates to focusing on civilizational unity on the educational front, so that you look for markers which go beyond language, which go beyond a particular school of thought, right? So, which is why, see, here's the thing. If the state's mental constitution is that of a nation state, it will affect its education policy as well. Whereas if it sees itself as a civilizational state, automatically it will understand that it cannot adopt a monolithic approach to education across the country, right? That would mean what? You're looking at partly decentralization of education so that the regional identity also gets a fair amount of impetus as far as the history curricula is concerned, and it's telescoping into the national identity or the civilizational identity. You need both. But where is the discussion on this front?
Yeah, that's a good one.
No discussion on this front. This is a discussion apparently for elite, rich Hindus, but nobody else is interested. I'm surprised. These are the money bags. Why can't these money bags put some pressure? How many questions do we have time
Yeah,
for?
actually we have 5 minutes, maybe we can stretch it to 10.
Okay.
But can we actually get questions from
Pooja, you had a
the,
question.
yeah, Pooja, you had a question, and yeah,
Yeah.
the younger,
Sure, please.
and I also have one suggestion. If you have a question, please do ask. Else you can also perhaps share an experience about your identity and make it into a question.
That's what I was going to do. I don't really have a question yet, but maybe I'll turn into one. You touched a little bit on this, but I think that from the Indian American identity specifically, we're not very good at playing the victims, and I can feel that I can talk about my own experience because there's so many other minorities around us that I feel in American history have been particularly marginalized. And I'm starting to realize the flaws in that thinking, and I understand what you're saying, but I guess how do you, I think from the Indian experience, not Indian American, you can see colonization and feel a lot of that victimhood. It was hard for me to really relate to that.
Right.
And as Indian Americans, most Indian Americans tend to be well off and have benefited in some way. So while there are things that I feel angry about appropriation, it is also hard to be completely a victim. Does that make
Right.
sense?
It makes a lot of sense. And I think she's touched upon something very, very important. A Jew, no matter wherever he is in the world, appropriates Holocaust. He relates to the Shoah. He relates to what happened. He knows the figures, he knows the numbers. And he knows who did it and what the reasons were. Unfortunately, we have allowed him to think of the hooked cross as the swastika. It's not a swastika, it's the hooked cross. Right? All of this has happened. How has this happened? And why hasn't this happened with us? Nationality of a Jew has not made a difference to his relatability to what has happened to his community, because the community has taken it seriously. How? Identity plus memory effectively determines the future of a civilization. How do they memorize it, so to speak? What is the context of the celebration of the Hanukkah? Why do they celebrate Hanukkah? It's not their new year for sure, right? So what is Hanukkah? Why is it celebrated?
Remembrance?
So when, yes please, somebody wants to,
It's their celebration of their
Of-
oppression by the government.
no, the influence of the Hellenistic regime. So a group of Jews decide to revolt against the Hellenistic regime, and this group was called the Maccabees. That is, although this is one of the few instances where Jews succeeded in any time in their history, militarily speaking, prior to the formation of the State of Israel, they celebrate that one incident and that victory to remember their identity. And that is celebrated across the world by the American Jew as much as the Israeli Jew. The next so-called victory that they have in their history is their defeat against the Romans when the second temple was actually blown to smithereens by a gentleman called Bar Kokhba. Okay? And that's a defeat that is celebrated. We don't even celebrate our victories, which we have so many. Okay? Therefore, memorialization, so to speak, and therefore entrenching it into the racial identity or the community's identity and the collective identity and collective memory is what makes each of these things relatable. That I think is possible. Yes,
One
please.
more question, sorry. So I feel that among peers, Indian American peers, there is kind of this resurgence in claiming their Indian identity, but it's a very Western Indian identity. Does that make sense? Like a very Western accepted Indian identity. So whether that be dance, it's not classical dance, it's like fusion, like whatever it is. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I do feel that when I've had kind of a reclaiming where I'm more interested in Hinduism, there's less of an acceptance about talking about that. So how do you suggest someone goes about that?
I don't think the way forward is to move backward. No, what I'm trying to make is, you can't stop any kind of fusion or any kind of innovation. At the same time, the responsibility falls in the community to ensure that the tradition in its as is where is form is also made available to the next generation. It is then so I'll explain how. So a new movement has started, and I have to go back to Israel because that country, I keep reading about it so much. I keep reading about it so much, not because I find a one-to-one equivalence. We are different in many ways. Theologically speaking or any other way speaking, we are different. But our experiences are similar. And therefore, you can take a couple of leaves out of their book and try and see what you can learn and adapt and use, okay, and improvise. Youngsters in Israel from secular Jewish backgrounds who have been kept away from traditional Jewish scripture have decided to set up schools and homes where they decide to bring youngsters of their age to discuss and reinterpret their own scripture without any adult being present there. Why am I making this point is for a community, especially the diaspora, the Indian diaspora, which has shown and showcased so much of entrepreneurial ability. Why can't we use the same entrepreneurial ability when it comes to this front? What help are you looking for from and from whom? From the US government or from the Indian government? They don't help us there, why will they help you here? You understand? So, my point is the community needs to start looking at itself for help, and it can come only from within, because fortunately this is one community that is not short or shy of resources or networks. I had a beautiful video that was circulated on WhatsApp a couple of weeks ago where Antakshari was being played on the verses of the Bhagavad Gita by youngsters of the age group of 9, 10, 8, 6 and 7. I don't think we played a role in it from India. Somebody else was doing a better job of it. I was told only recently that the Cambridge curricula on religion and religious movements in India now speaks of the Satyasai movement and the ISKCON movement. So here is a Cambridge education system that speaks more about Indian bhakti movements than any of our Indian education systems. Perhaps we should start exposing our children to those books. As opposed to WhatsApp University or the word of mouth, which is apocryphal in nature, why not expose them to better books? Start book clubs. I'm sure more solutions and much better solutions in terms of creativity are possible. My point is, I'm just reorienting your compass. Don't look to others for help. This is something that you can do. particularly with resources such as internet at your disposal. So I don't see what is not available at your disposal.
One more question maybe from a
I think,
young.
So there's a youngster at the back.
Yeah, there you go.
Yes.
I think you also touched about how we have similarities to indigenous people around the world.
Yes.
And kind of continuing on our point of relating to the history of oppression. I think one thing that we haven't talked about enough as Indians, because I understand that we have had a history, a troubled history with Islamic invasion. They crusaded our land the same way the Crusaders crusaded their land. And so, in regards to the British Empire, however, I would argue, I know someone made the point that they adopted our culture and whatnot. They really didn't. They were the ones, I would argue, who were largely responsible for the devaluation, the global devaluation and demonization of our culture.
Agreed.
So, what I would argue is that if we want to discuss how we were victimized, I think we should start with the British Empire because it builds solidarity with so many people around the world who have been pillaged by the British Empire.
I'm absolutely with you. A huge round of applause for that. I completely agree with you because I made the same point in the last talk, and the point was this. When somebody decides to unsheath the sword and attacks you, that physical attack inspires a physical response and a physical resistance. But when somebody subtly chooses to deracinate you through education, robbing you of your system of education, you don't even know that your roots are being cut, and you subscribe to the other's point of view. That was the genius of the colonial system. And the impacts of that are felt even today. You're in a position to concretely say who destroyed which temple with a sword, but you're not in a position to say who took which Indic traditional knowledge system. I'm not going to, this is not my area of expertise, but nevertheless it appeals to my common sense, and therefore I'll make this point. Reading tarot cards has become fashionable. Feng Shui has become fashionable. But astrology is somehow superstitious. Very convenient. And the surprising part is, the rules of astronomy were laid down by the same people who actually authored the treatises for astrology. So you're willing to buy those treatises which relate to science, which is astronomy, but you junk everything that they say about astrology. I'm not going to say it's right or wrong because I'm not qualified to say so. I'm simply saying at the outset, the moment I mention that particular subject, there's a mental barrier, there's a filter which says, oh, superstition. Right? So I'm with you. But there is a need to speak about both because you're currently under the onslaught of both. That is a fact. Both sets of aggressions are being perpetrated even in modern secular constitutional India, using the means of the constitution as the pretext, using weaponized ideologies under the name of equality, under the name of minoritism, under the name of multiculturalism, under the name of secularism and whatnot. So you need to be aware of both, because today your response needs to be both physical as well as mental, intellectual as well as non-intellectual. It is imperative. When they spew venom at the Indian army, they're effectively taking away the incentive for poor Hindus, middle class Hindus and other Hindus who are willing to go to the army from joining the army because that institution is being maligned, to rob it of the human resources that are otherwise willing to join it. Who will protect the country later? History has taught us that we must respect the fact that we are one political unit today with a standing army of 13 million or whatever it is. That is something that you need. And if you keep spitting venom at that particular institution, you are taking away the incentive of every community which takes pride in joining that institution for generations together as a legacy. Therefore, your response needs to be at both fronts. Today it has become fashionable to use this word, I am an intellectual Kshatriya. I don't really know what it means. That means you don't have the guts to be a real Kshatriya. Admit it. You need both.
Shastra and Shastra.
You don't want to do what is necessary, and you will not even let somebody else do what is necessary. So who's going to protect you? Do you really think logic is going to stand up and convince the barbarian when he decides to behead you? I don't think that makes sense at all. You need the Shastra as well as the Shastra under the constitutional framework, period. Is that it?
Yeah. along with that, here's a little gift for you. Take it out and you can put the package too.
Hey.
This is a painting that,
Wow.
yeah, that's for you.
Thank you, sir.
Take a picture
Sure.
and share it with us.
I will.
And Sai, I think, did you mention, he did that, right?
Yeah,
So-
I saw the signature.
Oh,
It's a
yeah.
shame.